he decided not to agree to that meeting because it was beneath his dignity. He was the Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom, and he didn't feel it was right, optically, as he said, to be seen in the same meeting as First Ministers. I am completely baffled by that argument. At the height of a health pandemic, that you would think that the optics was more important than the substance. I think that's very baffling.
Mark Drakeford, why are you leaving?
Well, I suppose it's because my contract is up. So I said when I was chosen as Labour leader that I thought 5 years was as long as anybody could manage to do this job. And I've a bit outstayed my welcome because actually I'm quite well into my 6th year by now. But I said that's what I would do, and I've done my best to stick to it.
What was it about 5 years when you took the job? What was it about 5 years? Why, successful prime ministers have gone on for longer, first ministers have gone on for longer. Why did you think it was 5 years? And why did you not, like so many people who've made a promise before getting into office, why did you not break it and go on and on and on?
Well, why 5 years? Well, a number of reasons, really. Partly age. I would be 70 later this year. And partly because if you're going to go beyond 5 years, it would mean having to lead the Labour Party into the next election in 2 years' time, and then inevitably having to go on a year or two into the next Senedd term. So it wasn't 5 years or 6 years, it was 5 years or 9 years. And I just don't think that 9 years is sustainable, given the pace of the job and the demands it makes on you. So to be fair to my party particularly, I thought what I will do is, if I'm lucky enough to do it, I'll lead the Labour Party through the next election in 2021, go through to halfway through this Senedd term, and then it will be time for somebody else to have their chance.
When you took office, December 2018, you became First Minister of Wales and leader of Welsh Labour. And you must have thought it was quite clear how things were going to pan out then. And then we had sort of the madness of politics of 2019, Brexit, general election, then the COVID pandemic, then all of the, you didn't know who was going to answer if you picked up the phone to number 10. How did what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years compare to your expectations when you took office?
Well, it's been entirely different. I expected when I became First Minister, one of the reasons why in the end I was willing to put my name forward, I thought that what we would be dealing with was Brexit. And I'd been the Brexit minister in the Welsh government. And I thought, well, I think I would have something to offer in getting us through that difficult period. But in fact, no sooner was Brexit breaking over us than we were into that sense of a perma-crisis. I think the whole time I've been here, it's been one crisis after another, including a war in Europe, a cost of living crisis, as well as the other things that you just mentioned.
Have you enjoyed it?
I've enjoyed bits of it. So that's the truth. There are bits of the job, like any job I've ever done, I think like a job anybody does. There are bits of it I really do enjoy, and there are bits of it which I won't miss when I finish.
Well, let's talk about the bits you liked first of all then. Let's focus on the positive. What did you enjoy about being First Minister?
Maybe two things to mention immediately. One is you are incredibly lucky that the people you meet, it is one of the really lovely parts of the job that I'm out and about, I'm meeting people, I'm hearing extraordinary stories, I'm seeing people who are doing fantastic things. So all of that and the variety that brings, that is, that's one of the bits of the job that lifts your spirits. The other part of the job that I enjoy tells you that I'm probably a bit odd in this way because, I enjoy the policy side of the job. I am quite comfortable sitting down for a couple of hours and reading stuff about a knotty problem that you've got to find a way through and different solutions that you can, all of that. I've always enjoyed that. And I don't I'm lucky. I don't mind making decisions. I don't find decision making hugely difficult. So all of that side of the job, I will miss some of that definitely.
So what won't you miss? What's been the bits of the job, and maybe things you weren't expecting, but what will you not miss about being first minister?
I won't miss the front of house stuff so much. I won't miss doing first minister's questions every week. I've got more used to doing interviews and stuff, but it's not the part of the job that I would say that I'm keenest on or best equipped at. So I worked for 10 years as the head of the First Minister's political office when Rodri Morgan used to sit in this office, and I would be next door. And uh, in some ways, I think that's the job that suited me the very best.
You liked being one step removed, behind the scenes, more behind the scenes.
Yeah, because it's a very privileged position. You're at the heart of everything. You see everything. You tend to be given by the then First Minister the difficult issues to have a think about and do some work on. But in the end, he went off and did the interviews, and he went off and answered the questions. So I think so. Yeah.
Tell me then how you see your role as First Minister. How does it fit into? We'll talk about some of the specifics, the individuals, in a moment. I'll ask about your former bosses, as we must at an exit interview. But how do you fit into the sort of the national picture, your relationship with Downing Street, with Labour HQ in London, with Labour HQ in Edinburgh? How do you make all of that work? Where do you fit into the jigsaw?
Well, I think differently in different contexts. In the Labour family, I think we fit quite easily, really. We are all part of the One Labour movement. I speak regularly enough with Keir Starmer. I'm not on the phone every week to him or anything, but I am absolutely confident that if I ever need to speak to him, I just send him a text message, and within an hour or whatever, we're on the phone and talking and things. So that's very, I've always felt that that part of what I do is not always straightforward. We don't always agree. You can't expect that, but good in the sense that you can always have the conversation, and you always know you're talking to someone who is basically of the same persuasion as you are. Relations with Downing Street have altered over the time that I've been First Minister and leading up to it, really. I lived through a decade of Labour Prime Ministers, and then we had nearly a decade of Conservative Prime Ministers where at least the relationship was respectful. I disagreed with Theresa May on most things you can think of, but she was never anything other than completely respectful of devolution. And, well, I'll give you just, this is a contrast which I think is a bit telling. On the day that Ford announced that he was leaving Bridgend in South Wales and 1,000 jobs were going to be lost, I did something which I tried to do very infrequently, which was that I got my office to contact the Prime Minister's office, Theresa May, and said that I would like to have a phone call with her that day to talk about the impact that that decision would have and what we could do together. And before the end of the day, that phone call had happened. When Tata Steel announced nearly 3,000 job losses in Port Talbot, I asked for a phone call with Rishi Sunak and was told that he couldn't find time in his diary. Now, I wasn't expecting a detailed and in-depth conversation with the Prime Minister, but I did find it very odd that on a day which was so significant for such a community, that he couldn't find even 5 minutes just to say, of course we'll work on this together with you. Let's make sure our officials are in touch, and I'll be keeping us close. Something like that, just to demonstrate that the UK government had the interests of a part of the United Kingdom at heart. The fact that he couldn't find 5 minutes really both surprised me, but had really, in my mind, the contrast was very stark.
Yeah. And what about the pandemic and the relationship? Because that was where, and I suppose if it had been if it had been a different type of crisis, which wasn't health, it may not have been quite so striking. But because health has devolved, you've got Boris Johnson in Downing Street making announcements, but they only actually apply in England. You're in Wales. Nicola Sturgeon's in Scotland. Decisions being made in Northern Ireland as well, depending on
Yes.
their political situation. Were you surprised by the lack of contact, the lack of flow of information that you had with Downing Street during the pandemic?
I was surprised by a whole lot of things, Matt. I was surprised, first of all, that the UK government made the decision to use public health legislation to navigate a way through the pandemic, which meant that decisions were inevitably devolved to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I fully expected until just a couple of days before the first lockdown that they were going to use civil contingency type powers, which were powers that are not devolved and would have put the United Kingdom government sort of much more in the driving seat. So I was surprised at the route that they chose. Once they chose it, then it becomes your responsibility to exercise the powers that only you can exercise.
Do you think it would have been better if it had been done on a national basis rather than having the different personalities and the different politics and the different geography playing out? Because ultimately, the virus didn't respect the line between England and Wales.
Well, look, I don't. Partly because what we have seen, the way that Downing Street was being run at the time, the idea that giving people who spent their whole time fighting one another like ferrets in a sack, giving them more responsibility, I think that's not the lesson I draw from the pandemic. I also think that the more it went on, the more you came to realize that you were having to make decisions that you needed to explain to people as close to the decision making as possible. But I should say this because I want to be fair as I can. I agreed with something that Boris Johnson said in his opening remarks in his statement to the inquiry, that we were always, all of us, heading in the same direction. When we were having to impose more restrictions, we were all having to do that. When we were coming out the other side and into better territory, all of us are trying to find a way of lifting those protections. We did it in different ways, we did it to different degrees, but the direction of travel was always very common across the whole of the United Kingdom. I wished that we'd had more regular contact as First Ministers with the Prime Minister. I would have been very happy to have had one meeting every 3 weeks. We use a 3-week decision-making cycle here in Wales. If we'd met once during that 3 weeks, it would have been a chance to share information, to understand better what other people were facing, to learn of some ideas that others were trying. I think we would all have made better decisions if we'd had a better chance to get round the table together. We now know that the Prime Minister at the time looked at that idea. He had a meeting about it, and he decided not to agree to that meeting because it was beneath his dignity. He was the Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom, and he didn't feel it was right, optically, as he said, to be seen in the same meeting as First Ministers. I am completely baffled by that argument. At the height of a health pandemic, that you would think that the optics was more important than the substance. I think that's very baffling.
How did you cope with the pressures, the decision making that you were making during the pandemic? Because bluntly, becoming the First Minister of Wales, it's not the same as being Prime Minister. You might go into there thinking, well, I'm going to have to make decisions about war and peace and deploying troops, and those are not things normally. Quite a lot of what the decisions of the First Minister aren't life and death. How did you cope with those decisions? Because quite often, what we knew then and definitely know now, there were no right answers.
No. Well, you're absolutely right, Matt. You don't come to do this job expecting to be making decisions of that magnitude. My own way of coping was to rely on collective decision making through our cabinet system. So I never felt I was making the decisions by myself. We would have, sometimes quite exhausting discussions of our cabinet, sometimes meeting 5 days in a row when we were facing the most difficult decisions, because I always wanted to be in a position where I felt every one of my ministerial colleagues had been able to ask every question that they thought needed answering, that they debated every decision, and that in the end we could come to a collective view of what the best answer we could come to would be. Because I always felt that I was making decisions on behalf of the whole of the Welsh government rather than just making them myself, you know, that was a great comfort to me in feeling the weight of responsibility that was clearly there for us all.
And even when you were picking through that, you were also trying to look after your wife, Claire, who I know
Yeah.
was vulnerable. Is it right you moved into a different building
Yes,
to try and
I
protect her
did.
during the pandemic?
I did very early on. Um, the chief medical officers of the three of the four nations issued instructions to people who needed to shield. My mother-in-law, Claire's mother, had come to live with us um, in March. She lived alone. She was 92 when she moved to live with us, and she lived um, on her own in the house that they'd all been brought up in.
Yeah.
And it was clear that, you know, she might have been very, very on her own in lockdown circumstances. So she came to live with us. And at that point, you know, you've got someone who's 92, and Claire was vulnerable because of her underlying health conditions. And I felt I was a risk to them because inevitably I was still having to come in most days and hold meetings with where there would be other people in the building and in the room. And that would mean I would be going home carrying whatever contacts I had come in with. So we were very lucky. At the bottom end of our garden, there was a granny flat that we had built about 10 years before, thinking that my mother or Claire's mother would need to come and live with us. They never did, and nobody ever lived in it. But it was available to me. So I moved down there, and you know, we would meet in the garden at a distance and talk about what had happened in the day and things. It wasn't we never saw each other,
Yeah.
but I never went in the house at all.
Wow. What a thing to have gone through all of that. Mark, let's talk about let's in some classic exit interview style. Let's sum up some of your former bosses for us. Carwyn Jones was probably your first boss, should we say? Is it when you were
Yeah.
in the assembly? Sum up Carwyn Jones in a word.
Well, Cameron was a very gifted politician, a very good communicator, one of the rare politicians I've seen who, you know, out on the doorstep, people would come to the door, they'd see who he was, he'd have a minute or two on the doorstep, and you could feel people going back in the house feeling better for having met him. You know, they were smiling. It's a real gift. And he had another gift. He probably wouldn't thank me quite so much for saying it, but he had another gift in politics, he was lucky in some ways. He was a lucky politician. Sometimes cards fell in his favour in a way, and he was very good at using those opportunities as well. But you know, there are some politicians who are lucky, and Carwyn, I think, had that about him as well.
What about Rhodri Morgan, your his predecessor as First Minister?
Well,
Sum up Rhodri in a word.
yeah, well, I was very close to Rodri. I'd known him for years and years before uh, devolution, and he asked me to come and work in his office when he became First Minister. Rodri was a towering politician, astonishingly gifted intellectually, um, very good company. He could talk to anybody about anything. He was absolutely the person you wanted to sit next to in the pub because he was funny and he was engaging but he was also incredibly serious in a way that he hid very successfully. You know, he had a mission during the time that he was First Minister. Devolution in Wales succeeded in the first referendum by a whisker. And his mission was to make sure that people in every part of Wales felt that the assembly belonged to them. And at the end of his period, there was a second referendum on whether the Senate should have primary lawmaking powers, much more powerful powers. And that was won hands down by a huge majority. And I remember him saying to me, "My job is done. I have managed over that 10 years to turn this institution from something that, you know, barely scraped through to something that is now absolutely embedded in the lives of people in every part of Wales."
He was obviously an MP before becoming a Welsh Assembly
Yeah.
member and then leader and First Minister. Did you have any regrets about? Did you ever think about becoming an MP? Was it always about the Welsh Assembly and being First Minister for you?
Oh well, it was neither of those things. I'm a politician by accident, not by design. I never expected to be doing what I'm doing now at all. So I never had, I was never one of those people who woke up at the age of 10 and said, one day I'm going to be Prime Minister. Um, but yeah, uh, we were very lucky that Rodri being an MP, because in those very early days of devolution, if there was something that needed sorting out, you knew that if he asked for a call with any Labour minister, he would get a call straight away. And that was hugely to our advantage. Insofar as I did have any, political ambitions, they were always about devolution and always about this institution. And I never ever entered any selection conference or anything to become a member of Parliament myself.
It was always about Cardiff. Let's talk about some of your national Labour leaders then. How fast? But who do you sort of consider your first Labour leader as a Labour politician?
I suppose the first person I remember myself personally and who saw would be Harold Wilson.
Yeah.
So as I'm growing up, Harold Wilson is Prime Minister. I remember going to hear him when he came to Carmarthen in West Wales, where I was brought up, hearing him speak there. Of course, Jim Callaghan, who succeeded him, was someone we knew very well in Wales, because although he wasn't from Wales, he was a Welsh MP, and he always loomed large in Welsh politics. The first Prime Minister who I met with any regularity, and that was always because I would have gone with Rodri, was Tony Blair.
Yeah.
So in those early days of devolution, the First Minister of Wales would go twice a year to Downing Street. There would only be four of us in the conversation. There was me with Rodri, and there was Tony Blair, and he would always have somebody different with them. They were always Scottish, and they were always called Alistair. That's the only thing I could be sure about. And the four of us, I would sit in and listen, really. And I remember those encounters very well, and they continued under Gordon Brown.
So go on then, sum up Tony Blair in a word for us.
Ooh, that's hard, isn't it? Well, I think when you were in the room with him, then you did feel his charisma.
Yeah.
I think charisma is a pretty dangerous quality in politics myself, but he did have it. When you were close up to him and in the same room, then you could feel it. You could see the way in which he would exercise, an influence over people. I was never a Blairite myself. Let me put that on the table as well in terms of politics. But I will say this, in a way that I think people have misunderstood and people in Wales have misunderstood, he absolutely understood devolution. I would sit listening on the phone to conversations that Rodri would have with him, not hugely often, but there would be an issue. Rodri would have a conversation with Tony Blair, and at the end of it, Blair would say to him, well, Rodri, I wouldn't be doing it that way, but you're the First Minister of Wales, and that's why we set up devolution. The idea that he was always interfering or that London Labour ran things in Wales, it really couldn't have been further from the truth. He really did understand that if you've set it up, then you must allow it to make its own decisions.
Yeah, it's interesting that. What about Gordon Brown then, in a word? Probably closer to your politics.
Yeah, closer. These days, I think genuinely a giant still of politics. I've had more to do with Gordon in recent years, and when you're with him, you get such a formidable sense of his intellectual grasp, his moral authority, his sense of politics. I think in some ways his political influence has been greater post being Prime Minister than he was in the short time that he was in the job. And he took over towards the end of a Labour period. He was never perhaps going to be too easy, but if you're with him, you get such a powerful sense of his grasp and the rootedness of his values is astonishing, I think.
And then obviously he lost in 2010 to be replaced by Ed Miliband. Sum up Ed Miliband in a word.
oh dear, I'm going to say something now. So I like Ed as well, but I thought Ed sort of came over as well-meaning, didn't he? And not always was able to convey to people the strength of the offer that he was able to make. But again, he leads Labour's thinking in terms of renewable energy and protecting us from climate change and so on. And I think he's a very powerful politician in his own right. But the times and the tides just didn't. If Cadwyn is a lucky politician, I don't think you could have said the same for Ed.
It's interesting that. So then he was then replaced in 2015 by Jeremy Corbyn. I looked this up. I think this is right. You were the only sitting cabinet member in any part of the UK to support Jeremy Corbyn in his bid for the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015.
So I was.
Presumably you agreed with his politics and you thought he'd be a breath of fresh air, and lots of people got caught up in that summer of 2015. Any regrets given what happened?
Well, I deeply regret that we didn't win the 2017 or the 2019 election. Look, I voted for Jeremy because of what he stood for. I didn't know him at all. I'd never met him. And truthfully, I never expected that he was going to win either. But, in the election, I've always thought that you should choose the candidate whose views and policies are closest to your own, and then vote for that because you want to send a message inside the Labour Party that that strand of thinking remains important. And that's what I did. In the end, in politics, if you can't win power, you can't do anything for anybody. I've told the story, Matt, a few times of on the morning of the 2019 election. It was a December election, dreadful conditions in which to bother people. I knocked the door of somebody in my own constituency. It's quite early on. It's between 10 and 11 o'clock. And this elderly lady came to the door and she said to me, I have voted Labour in every election since I was first able to vote. And today is my last chance to see a Labour government. And we let that person down, didn't we? We let that person down because she was probably right. She probably wasn't going to see a Labour government beyond that. And if you are serious about politics, then you have to find a path in which you can translate the things that matter to you into persuading enough people to support those ideas. And we failed to do that. And, you can't just shrug off that responsibility.
I mean, the remarkable thing now, of course, is that despite the dreadful defeat in 2019, it now looks like the Labour Party, at least according to the polls, is on course back to government. So sum up Keir Starmer in a word.
Gifted. There we are. That's my word for him. So, because I worked a lot with Keir Starmer when I was the Brexit minister here, and he was the Brexit spokesperson for Labour. I felt I got a very powerful sense of his strengths, which are that he's very serious about politics. He's very good at detail. He's very good at seeing past detail to the strategic decisions that need to be made. He has the most difficult job in politics, to be the leader of the opposition. I think the strengths that I have seen in him will make him a very powerful prime minister. And in that sense, I think people will, he has the gifts that you need to be a successful prime minister. Those gifts are harder to put to work as leader of the opposition. So I think he'll come into his own if, as I certainly hope, he is the next prime minister.
Does it worry you that Labour run Wales is one of Rishi Sunak and other Tory ministers' favourite slogans, that whether it's 20-mile-per-hour zones or the NHS or whatever it might be, you and your record is used as a stick to beat Keir Starmer with? Does that make for uncomfortable conversations with Keir?
Well, it's a compliment. That's how I see it. There were times when they couldn't even find Wales on the map, let alone know what we did. The fact that we have a record and we've achieved things, and and they are Labour things. I wouldn't expect Rishi Sunak to support the things that we have done. So I understand why he wants to make that contrast. But I think I regard it as a compliment to the record that we have built up that they take so much interest in us.
Well, so I suppose that's a good way of putting it. Okay, let me turn to some classic exit interview questions. Would you recommend this job to a friend or family, someone you cared about, going into politics, doing the job you've been doing as First Minister?
Yes, because I heard Hillary Clinton do an interview in Swansea just a few months ago, and somebody from the audience said to her, you've had a terrible time in politics. Look how you've been attacked by Trump and all the right in America and everything like that. Surely you wouldn't say to anybody that this was the right thing to do. And I thought she gave a very powerful answer, which is that if good people leave the stage, all you do is leave that space to the bad actors. So tough as it is, and goodness me, she knew all about that. You've just got to persuade yourself and persuade others that for all the difficulties of the job and for all its downsides, unless good people are prepared to put themselves forward for it, all you do is leave the stage empty for people who don't share your views and don't share your values. So for all my hesitation and thinking about, the downsides that would come with it, I think that is the more powerful argument.
And coping with the job, losing your wife while, in the most high-profile job in politics. And we during this series we've spoken to lots of MPs who talk about their children, the things they looking back on a political career now and thinking, well, I missed that moment. I'm missing bedtimes, missing parents' evenings, all that sort of thing. What impact has the role had on your family, and any regrets about that?
Well, your family do make huge sacrifices for you to do these jobs. I never made any decisions about what I was trying to do without having had the discussion with everybody first. And, I only did those things where I felt that my family were there to support me in doing them. So in that sense, we went into this with our eyes open. Claire would say to me if I went home, as I sometimes did, and would complain about the sort of day I'd have, her answer to me always was, well, nobody makes you do this, do they?
That's really helpful, yeah.
It was the bargain, wasn't it? If you're going to do it, then don't complain, because everybody's having to carry the burden of this together.
Oh, that's a great way of looking at it. What if because you've been in politics for a long time, have you changed in your politics? I talked about, you previously people said your politics was like Michael Foot. You clearly had politics close to Jeremy Corbyn. You've talked about being a Republican since the age of 14. Yeah. Has any of that changed?
I think I've become more radical as I've got older. I think that's maybe because you've got less time in front of you. So when there are things you want to get done, you feel more impatient about getting them done than maybe in your 20s when you think the world will never end, and you'll always be there with it. So if my politics have changed, it's in the direction of becoming more impatient for change, more impatient to do the things that I think would make Wales a fairer, better place, a place that lives up to the piece of legislation that maybe has the most influence of all on what we do, which is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We are under an obligation here. Every time you make a decision as a minister, you have to ask yourself, what difference will this decision make to people who are here today? But you've got to ask yourself consciously the question, what difference will this make to generations who come after us as well? And I think that pushes you in the direction of more radical politics as well.
So radical is to contemplate Wales as an independent country ever?
Not for me. I think Wales is better off in the United Kingdom. I think the United Kingdom is better off for having Wales in it. But I do think the case for the United Kingdom has become weaker under Boris Johnson and his successors, particularly, and that there will be a really serious job for the next Labour government to rebuild the case for the United Kingdom. I want the United Kingdom to be a place where people in Scotland, Wales, and England want to belong, choose to belong, not feeling that they've got no choice but to pursue a better path without it. I think there's a powerful case to be made for the United Kingdom. It's not been articulated in recent times. I hope an incoming Labour government will make the case for a solidarity union, a union where people want to belong to the United Kingdom because they see the benefits that it brings to them. And I think that will be a powerful case for Wales.
So, Mark Drakeford, at the end of your exit interview, what will you do next?
Well, I'll be a Senate member for the next 2 years on the back benches. Looking forward to that. I sometimes quote Tony Benn to say that I'm stopping being First Minister to spend more time in politics. So I'm looking forward to, devoting my time to those issues that I think are the most important. I'll be on my allotment a good deal more often, I hope, than I can at the moment. I'll have more time for my grandchildren. There's lots of things which I'm looking forward to doing because I'll have more time.
We've got to that whole chat, Mark, and I haven't mentioned Caerphilly cheese.
Wow, more time for enjoying cheese. I am very lucky when I go around Wales. I'm very often given cheese by people made in their part of Wales. So, as I travel about, there'll be more time to enjoy that.
More time for that. What's your current favourite then? You must have discovered some local highlights.
Oh, well, there are some wonderful cheeses to be had in Wales. So, not far from where I come from in West Wales, there's a little village called Cenarth, which has a wonderful river that falls through it. It's a tourist attraction. There is a cheesemaker in Cenarth who makes the most wonderful cheeses. So, it'll be a pleasure to go there.